will first kick it off with Torsten, my colleague and good friend, CEO of uNoodle, and Jeff Barrows, who has come here from Paris to share with us the results of what we can judge a very interesting study that has been led over the last few years. I'll turn the floor to Torsten and let him present Jeff and this work, and then I'll introduce each and every one of you thereafter. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivier. I will take 3 minutes to give you a very, very little bit of context before you hear from who we're here to really hear from, which is Jeff right next to me. It's a joy to be here. I want to just share a quick personal story. I started this company, uNoodle, together with my co-founder, Rebecca Wong, who was a Korean refugee from the Korean War who moved with her, or fled, I guess, with her family to Argentina. Grew up in Argentina, did really well in school, and ended up getting into MIT, got 2 degrees at MIT, and then moved on to Stanford, where she was doing her PhD. And I met her in San Francisco, and I, never initially saw her as a female co-founder. I saw her as a co-founder, and I felt very fortunate that I was allowed to start a company with her. So this whole idea of male founders versus female founders of startups for me was something very odd that I have, being next to Rebecca in a lot of different meetings and fundraising and going through years of building a company together has been a very eye-opening experience. And I think for both Rebecca and myself, that's why uNoodle as a company and as really the social enterprise that it is, has always been really interested in leveling the global playing field for entrepreneurs. And that's what we do until this day, is we do programs with a variety of different partners that are intended to open up opportunities across the world in all sorts of ways and level the playing field. But part of that is to look into the data that we're creating. So the platform, and this is why Jeff is here, the platform is essentially a sourcing and selection platform. So you run all these very structured programs where entrepreneurs are selected for opportunities. This could be financial opportunities, grants, but it could also be programs of different kinds. And of course, we've been involved in Womena in that capacity, which has also been really an interesting process. But all that data that's collected about how people are evaluated is really, really interesting to look into, because it's global, it's comparative, and it's qualitative. So we're able to see both quantitative and qualitative. And I think it was Penny who said earlier something about when there is a virtual way of evaluation, some of the gender biases actually leave the room. If you're evaluated in a not in-person way, we're actually able to see that you're evaluated much more based on your merits and not necessarily based on gender stereotypes. And when we look at our data, even before we started working with Jeff and his team, we saw that we have about 28% female founders on uNoodle globally, and this is out of about 180,000 entrepreneurs. It's a huge data set. Those 28%, when we look at who then are selected for opportunities and win grants and sort of move on in the world, we also see 28% women. So we're not observing a gender bias in the virtual selection, sourcing and selection process that happens on the platform. However, when we look at top-tier venture capital firms and who they invest in, we only see about 5% female founders in the top-tier cohort of companies that are invested in. So something happens after the process where you are selected for something, could be an accelerator or a grant or an opportunity, to later growth and success. And that's what we're really interested in. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context here. Jeff then came to us, I want to say 3 years ago. I think you were at Berkeley at the time, and said, hey, I want to study this data set. I want to look into, can we say something about what programs work, what programs don't work? Can we say something about if you give money to entrepreneurs, is there causality? Can we actually say that this money helps them move forward? And a number of other cool things. So I'm going to stop talking and let Jeff do a very quick intro to his work, and hopefully we'll get some questions.
All right, Torsten, thanks for the introduction. My name is Jeffrey Barrows. I'm an economist at the École Polytechnique in Paris, but I'm in fact not French, I'm American. I'm very happy to be here today to present this research that it's not published yet. It's hot off the presses. These are actually unpublished results, but I'm in the process of writing up the draft now. if you're interested in the details, they'll be available very shortly. And you can check my website or give me an email, and this information will be publicly available. But you guys get a sneak preview because Torsten asked me to come. You can't hear it on the tape? How about here? Okay. So by way of introduction, it's widely acknowledged at this point that entrepreneurship is critical for lifting people out of poverty as well as for stimulating aggregate growth. And as a result, there's lots of government and NGO and private firms that implement policies that are designed to try and encourage entrepreneurship. Grant prize awards, accelerator programs, incubator programs, et cetera. The rationale for these types of programs is very straightforward. On one hand, prizes or incubator space supplies entrepreneurs with the necessary early stage funding and support that they need to grow their ideas when other types of funding are usually hard to secure. And secondly, if you win the signal from winning an award or a prestigious place in an accelerator program might help entrepreneurs secure VC funding down the line, which in turn helps the firms grow. Okay? So these arguments imply that being part of an entrepreneurship program should correlate with firm success, but it actually doesn't say anything about the causality impact, about whether or not being part of the program actually causally impacts and helps firms succeed. The reason for that is that if the credit markets are working very well and efficiently, then those good business ideas would have found funding anyways, in which case programs are only crowding out private markets and they're not actually increasing the total stock of entrepreneurship and innovation in the economy. That means that it's an open empirical question whether or not participation in receiving a grant prize or participation in incubators has a causal impact in helping startups succeed, and that's exactly the question we're taking up in this study. The way we're going to address it is we're going to make use of what in economics language is called a quasi-natural experiment, which owes to the competitive selection process into program participation. As everyone in this room probably is well aware, grant prize awards and incubators and accelerators are often awarded as the result of a competitive process among many potential entrepreneurs. Donor organizations collect applications from potential entrants, and they evaluate them, and they think about them, and they score them in terms of quality and potential success. And this generates a ranking for each competition, as I've depicted in this hypothetical example here, and donor organizations then make awards based on these rankings. Now, if the evaluations are any good at all, you would expect that higher ranked firms are going to end up doing better anyways in the end because they're higher quality, or they're expected to do better. So just comparing program participants to non-participants is unlikely to give you the causal impact of the program. It's going to be very difficult to tease apart the pure selection effect of the judges from the causal impact of receiving the grant or being part of the incubator. However, what we're able to do in this study is make use of the threshold cutoff that's going to be a feature of almost every competition. With a limited number of prizes that are available, there's going to be some critical rank. Here it's depicted as, say, 10. If the program has had 10 prizes to award, the top 10 ranks are likely to, top 10 ranked firms are likely to participate in the program, and everyone who misses the cutoff is likely not to participate in the program. This means that if we look right around that cutoff, if we look at, in this example, firms 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, they should have roughly the same quality. There's going to be minor imperceptible differences, but it's basically going to wash out in the regressions. So if you concentrate just on the cutoff, we're going to have firms of basically the same quality. So selection is taken care of, but we're going to have a discontinuous jump in the probability that the firm participates in the program. This is going to give us basically treatment versus control firms with which to test for the causal impact, and that's how we're going to identify it. The data set comes from the administrative records of UNoodle, which is Torsten's company that has judged hundreds of competitions in many different sectors and many different countries around the world in the past several years. And for each one from the judge data, for each one of these competitions, I'm able to recreate this ranking order and the critical threshold. Okay? Now, the key challenge of the paper is and in startup research in general, is to assess the success of startup firms. Now, this is very difficult, and it leads to sort of a dearth in research in this area because startup firms, they tend not to even be incorporated yet. They usually don't have revenue or profits. They don't show up in traditional data sets. So it's very hard to analyze which startups are doing well or even find these firms and see if they're still alive. So in order to do this RD analysis, I need to measure the success of these startups years after they participated in the competitions that were organized by Torsten's company. So it was a big data collection exercise. We have 25,000 firms in the data set overall, and we ended up collecting outcome metrics for about 8,000 firms. We have two types of outcome metrics. The first are what I call the subjective metrics, and these are metrics that we came up with on our own in consultation with UNoodle. And I call them subjective because they rely on the subjective opinion of a research assistant. Basically what we did is we hired an army of researchers in California to come into the UNoodle headquarters and look for every single firm that participated in a competition that was judged by UNoodle. And they spent 20 minutes looking for the firm, and if they could find a live website for the firm, they recorded the website, and that's our first metric, alive. It's just 0 or 1. Can we even find a working website for these firms? And this is 4 or 5 years after a competition. Conditional on finding a live website, we then asked the RAs to make a subjective evaluation of how good the website seems to indicate the firm is doing. Does it have a modern design? Is it easy to get around? Does it show evidence of recent activity? Do they have a good description of the team? All the kinds of things that people in this room probably are well aware indicate that the website is doing pretty well. Now, we didn't take it at face value, however. We think that these subjective metrics should give a sense of the signal of the quality of the firm. Luckily, for a subset of the firms, we also have what I call objective metrics. These are more economic variables that you're used to thinking about in terms of measuring firm performance. These come from the business aggregator dataset Mattermark, which we get about 35% coverage in Mattermark. And for any firm that we can find in Mattermark, we're going to have the total amount of funding that the firm received, the number of employees, the number of unique web visits, Facebook likes, all sorts of things that are going to make it easier for us to benchmark against other studies. In addition, we're able to, so the first thing I do in the study is I show that these subjective metrics line up incredibly well against the objective metrics. It was really amazing that when we first sat down and designed these things, Torsten told me that if you show me the website, I can tell you how well this firm is doing. And it was really borne out by the RAs. I'll show you the correlations at the end if we have time. If the RAs think the firm is doing well, Mattermark confirms it. And we're going to use these two metrics basically in tandem in order to analyze the impacts. Okay, so in a 7-minute presentation, we jump right to the results here. These are the point estimates and 95% confidence intervals associated to each of these 8 outcome metrics. We have the 3 subjective metrics, and then we do some projections to get at the objective metrics from Mattermark. The point estimate is a regression estimate, and then that blue bar is what we call the 95% confidence interval. And if you remember your statistics, that confidence interval should cover the true impact about 95% of the time. And what we find is that across the board, winning a competition absolutely matters on average for future firm success. The point estimates are around 50, 75% increase over a base value. Those are, in terms of the web score and the general score, they seem large, but if you think about funding or employees, we're talking about 50% more employees down the line for a firm that won the competition compared to a firm that didn't. That's a sizable economic impact. Right. So I think maybe I'll stop there and take some questions. But this is this is evidence of a causal impact from a grant prize award, accelerator, incubator, which might speak to credit market frictions. If the credit market was working perfectly, you would not expect to see these kind of impacts. We all know the credit markets don't work perfectly, but what's really nice here is that we actually have data from startups, and we can show the impacts. If we have time, I can get into some of the differences across regions and across different dimensions of heterogeneity. Okay, so with that, should I just field some questions?
Awesome, thank you, Jeff. So I have like 100 questions, but I think I can always talk to Jeff afterwards. I think we want to spend maybe 5 minutes on a couple of questions from the audience, but really, hopefully you'll be able to connect with Jeff afterwards, those of you that are really interested, because we have fantastic panelists here afterwards. So if you have a question, could you just mark and then use your microphone here. Any questions to the research of impact of these programs? Luis, I think you were first, and I think that was Karen. Excellent. Luis.
I don't want to take any more time of this, but you have analyzed accelerators and programs and all that. So this is the aggregate of it. Do you have an insight of which one of those approaches are most effective in terms of getting the results? Okay.
It's a little bit noisy when you start breaking up the data. I can't do a whole lot in terms of heterogeneity. However, this one actually worked out pretty well. So here we have the different types of programs. I've lumped accelerator with incubator because I find it difficult to actually distinguish between the two. And across both accelerators and grants, you have basically indistinguishable point estimates. They seem to work for both accelerators and grants. If you thought that like education was super important for like educating, if you just throw money at the entrepreneur, it doesn't do anything. And actually, what we're doing here, what's really important is to train the entrepreneur. It doesn't seem to play a much bigger role. That just winning a grant prize without any acceleration absolutely has an impact. And in the study, I do a lot of this heterogeneity across different dimensions. I do as much as I can. That's quite important in the study.
Karen?
Thank you. I think this is really interesting research. So two questions and a comment, and one was related to what Luis just asked. I think it's really important, and the research has started to do this, to unpack the different components of interventions, because they may have differential effects for men and women before you really get to the aggregate findings. And my colleague, it's a group of people at the bank, our colleagues in the Development Economics Unit and the Gender Innovation Lab, have started to do that for various kinds of interventions like business plan competition. So David McKenzie has a paper on a business plan competition that we did impact evaluation on in Nigeria, which had had good effects for men and women, slightly larger effects for women, but not statistically significant. And then we've had impact evaluations on things like different types of training programs, how the training program is delivered, whether it's in person or on the web, virtually. So I think we have to start to really go into the granularity. So that's just a comment. And the second is, the question is the outcome measures.
Yeah.
And I think the outcome measures are really important. So some people think that increases in, of course, in the growth of a business measured in terms of profits or sales, which is hard to get admittedly, but is important, obviously, growth of employees. But then there's a set of people that also want to look at increases in, I'm not sure what to call it, empowerment, if you will, but self-efficacy, confidence, et cetera, of women themselves is really, really important. And then the correlation of which type of intervention with each of these kinds of impacts is probably important. And the type of intervention that may really work to increase sales and profits may not be the same kind of information that helps to increase the confidence, competence, self-efficacy, whatever you call it.
Yeah, I totally agree. We came up with every outcome metric we could. If we had any other outcome metrics, we would love to use them. And I completely agree, it might change. I wanted to get to one result here, which was important for this group here. When I break it out by female on the team versus female not on the team, these are the heterogeneous results. There's definitely a statistically significant impact for an all-male team. However, there's not a statistically significant impact for a team that has a female on it. Now, the point estimates are positive. That's good. They're not super different from the one on the male side, but I can't rule out zero. Now, this is very interesting, a little bit disappointing from a research perspective. I'd point out kind of two explanations, but I'd love if people had other ideas. First is just a very weak statistical argument, is that we just don't have that many women in this data set. We've got much more statistical power for the all-male team, and that's probably what I'm going to hang my hat on, is that the point estimates aren't that different. We just have big standard errors. There's nothing I can say. Now, there's a deeper argument about, which gets to sort of the multifaceted nature of interventions, is it enough to just give a grant to a female-headed team or a team with females on it? Do you need more infrastructure around and helping people all the way through the chain? That's a much more interesting argument that might be also an explanation for these things and worthy of discussion. However, with the data I have, I can't really distinguish between those two. All I can say is that statistically for the female side, it's quite noisy.
This is so fascinating. I wish sometimes I wasn't a founder CEO, but instead I was a data scientist, researcher. I could just dive into this and spend hours on it. But I know we're all here for many other reasons, so I think we actually have to move on to the next side, but Jeff and I will be working on this much more going forward for sure to answer some of these questions. So thank you guys. Back to you, Olivier.
Biuke, please.
Just one final question. Did you look at this data at a regional level or at a country base?
Yeah, we did. So we have country of origin of the entrepreneur, and it's kind of noisy, but we use some World Bank data. World Bank has this great data on the cost of starting a business and the number of procedures to start a business, and we actually found that there were very significant impacts for those countries where the cost of starting a business is high. They're not a whole lot higher than they are for the more developed countries, but we do see, even with a smaller statistical size, we have impacts across the board, which was very good to see.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I think that, you know, the idea was here to give you a teaser of the work that Jeff has been doing and of the work that you have been cooperating on, Torsten, at UNoodle. We don't have time, of course, to get in depth, but I'm sure that you'll come back and once the final presentation and results are there and make that presentation.